Thomas Christensen. They are two of the giants of European political science and two of the foremost experts about European integration. So there can be hardly any better name to close the second day of our seasonal school. Yesterday, for their information, as well as for us, we did talk about the UK and Brexit. Today, we've been discussing the EU and Brexit, and surely Thomas Christiansen and Brigid Laffan's opinion and perspective on such issues would be very interesting to hear. Let me just say a few words without stealing much time from our speakers. Professor Brigid Laffan is the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. She's also the director of the Global Governance Program there in Fiesole. Before, she was a professor of European politics at University College Dublin, and she has written at length about all aspects of integration, distinctively on issues such as Ireland and the European Union, such as core periphery relationships and the European Union. And of course, when the Brexit saga started with the referendum, she has been a recurrent contributor, both in academia, but also in newspapers, blogs, to really shape public opinion on these matters. She has also won a number of prizes and recognition for her work. I won't list them all here, not to occupy all the space that we are given, but to make a long story short, we're really, really proud to have Brigid Laffan here closing this session. And moving to our other speaker, Professor Thomas Christensen. He has been working in the Netherlands as a chair in European institutional politics at the University of Maastricht for quite some years before moving to Italy at Luis Guido Carli in Rome in September 2019. Thomas Christensen is also the executive editor of one of the top journals in European studies, which is the Journal of European Integration. He has written on all aspects of the integration process, both in domestic politics and external policies. For instance, and most recently, he has edited a book on China and the European Union, and very relevant for our talk here, a book together with Diane Fromage on Brexit and democracy, the role of parliaments in the UK and the EU, Palgrave in 2019. He has also worked in the UK, and likewise, Brigid Laffan had a very European career, moving from country to country all over Europe. It is therefore a great pleasure again to have them here, and without further ado, I will give the floor to Brigid Laffan first and Thomas Christensen later for an introductory talk on the topic of the day for 20 minutes each. Then we will open the floor for the question and answer session, giving as usual priority to our student participants, and we will then close the session down. Thanks so much again on behalf of all of us to be here. Brigid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all, and it's a pleasure to share a platform with Thomas. We go back a long way. One of the things you learn about European studies is it's a relatively small community. I think I will share my slide screen, but before I begin, I want to say two things. One, that it's important that you understand that when it comes to Brexit for me is not just a question of a set of academic issues. It is very interesting from a social science perspective, but I happen to be Irish, and Brexit is really dangerous for the island of Ireland. It is truly the externalities of Brexit for the island of Ireland are a gift that we could have done without from our near neighbours. So I take Brexit also very personally, but it is an amazing, it raises extremely interesting social science puzzles. And for me, the biggest puzzle is how an advanced democracy and economy sets out on a road to Brexit that and here I'm using a quote from a very senior council official who was literally in the room for this entire process. And when asked about what were the considerations that that drove the latest group of Brexit negotiators for the future relationship negotiation, he concluded it was 80% sovereignty and 20% the economy. In other words, the normal material considerations and interests that one would think would drive negotiations like this were simply 20%, whereas the idea of sovereignty for the United Kingdom, defined by Boris Johnson, was 80%. So that's a very interesting social science puzzle of how the material is completely overwhelmed by ideology and by the power of an idea. And for me, that's a very interesting social science puzzle. But I won't just talk about sovereignty this afternoon. I will share my screen and use my 20 minutes to, and I just need to get the slideshow. Now, unfortunately, unfortunately, I'm not able to start this. Here. The WebEx is covering the top panel and not allowing me get at the slideshow.
You can also do it at the bottom, next to the slider, the first symbol on the bottom right, next to the slider. No, the one up next to that, to the right. No.
Yeah, I'm getting there. Yeah, great.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to talk about three things this afternoon. Firstly, how the EU framed Brexit, because the argument I will make is that the way in which the EU framed Brexit was very significant in how the EU responded to Brexit. Secondly, I'll talk about how the EU has so far managed Brexit. And then how do we explain the outcome? How do we explain both the withdrawal agreement and the TCA? So, but it's important also for scholars looking back at the initial late 16, early 17 academic responses to Brexit. I give you three quotes from very, very significant scholars of European integration in Europe. Ben Rosmond, who said that what Brexit might mean for both the UK and the EU has very quickly become the defining question of contemporary European politics. Krastev said, if the disintegration of the EU was recently considered unthinkable, after Brexit, in the eyes of many, it's almost inevitable. And Matthias, the United Kingdom vote to leave the European Union triggered the worst political crisis the EU has faced. Now, those were very astute and scholars of European integration, and they were all wrong. The initial response, because in fact the EU Brexit has not led to disintegration, although there is an element of disintegration in it, it is not the defining question of contemporary European politics, and it is most certainly not the most significant political crisis the EU has ever faced. But the very fact that scholars responded to Brexit in that way in autumn 16, early 17, is an indication of how serious the potentiality of Brexit was for the EU at that period. And I am at the moment, I'm researching a book on the EU response to Brexit. And one of the things that comes through in all of the interviews we're doing is just how seriously the EU took the challenge of Brexit from the beginning. They had already planned, they had two sets of lines to take. before the result was out. One if it was a remain and one if it was a leave. And already in the weeks leading up to Brexit, the EU was beginning internally to think about what if the result is leave? What do we do and how do we respond? And so what happened from the 24th of June onwards had been considered in the weeks leading up to the referendum on the 23rd. So the second argument I will make in the book is that Brexit compelled the EU to draw on its strengths, both its strengths and resources and identity as a polity. The EU responded like a polity, not an international organization, but like a polity that understood that its very existence was potentially at stake. And it also drew on its strengths in terms of market power and as a producer of European public goods. So Brexit forced the EU to act as a collective power in a very strategic way. And this began with the framing of Brexit. Political actors can't ignore big events. The EU couldn't on the 24th of June 2016 pretend Brexit hadn't happened and that the result was not what the result was. Brexit demanded a response from the EU. The leaders of the EU, both of the supranational institutions and the national capitals, had to begin to grapple with what did Brexit mean, how should it be interpreted, and how should we respond? And as we know from the literature, and I use Kingdon here, but there's a vast literature on the importance of framing, there are great political stakes in problem definition. How a problem is interpreted and framed matters to subsequent outcomes, because frames are very powerful nudges and they affect the architecture of choice that's used in subsequent political deliberation. So how did the EU frame Brexit? The initial framing of Brexit took place between the 24th of June 2016 and the 29th. In other words, extremely rapid framing of Brexit. Three documents, only three. A statement by Tusk, a statement by the supranational leaders plus the Dutch presidency of the Council. So two statements on the 24th and the conclusions of an informal European Council on the 29th of June. And after that, the framing of Brexit was extremely consistent from then on. This was when the EU decided this is how we're going to respond and this is what it means. So firstly, all the statements highlighted unity as an ambition and an objective. We're determined to keep our unity at 27. We are united in our response. We will be united. So unity was the first almost ecological response of the system to Brexit. Secondly, the reassertion of the collective commitment to something called the European Union, that the European Union is the framework for the common future. It will continue, and it is our way of dealing with the 21st century. In other words, just because the British have decided to leave, we will still be a European Union, albeit an EU 27. And again, that's a pretty, one would anticipate that a political system will respond to protect itself. The third element of the framing, and this was something that proved very consequential and was also very difficult for the British to internalize, and that was that from the 24th of June 2016, the UK continued as a member state of the EU, but it was in a limbo. It was a country en route to third country status. And this was in the references in all of these documents. they referred to, we will negotiate the future relationship with the EU or with the UK as a third country. Now, what that did was it transformed an endogenous internal EU shock to an exogenous shock, because it was essentially othering of the United Kingdom from the beginning. And then, as always in the EU, process extremely important to the frame. The EU always relies on process. And of course, it had the process, it had Article 50, it did not want a disorderly UK exit. So it said, this is how we do it. The procedures are there, we have the rules, this is a legal process, and this is the track that you are going on. So the British were put on a journey to third country status, and secondly, the train tracks for that journey were process driven from Article 50 onwards. But then the EU also began to use other leverage in terms of maintaining that track, and that was the famous mantra of NNWN. And there's disputed parenthood for NNWN, because like anything that's a success, many people claim it. But NNWN was no negotiation without notification. In other words, we will not talk to you until you tell us that you are leaving. And what that did was it bought the EU time to organize. It avoided the British being given multiple access points and an ability to start influencing and testing water, etc., etc. In other words, it cut off what is an extremely important part of a negotiation, what one might be called the pre-negotiation. So this initial framing was very consistent. And what it did two things. It allowed the EU to absorb the shock. It was a shock absorber for the EU, and it signaled to the British, this is how the world is going to be. Now, the second, and again, because the framing is one thing, and you can have a rhetoric of unity, but to deliver unity is quite another. So how did the EU then manage Brexit from the 24th of June 16 to today? The first thing, and again, this was systemic, that the senior agents of these institutions did was they insulated day-to-day EU policy making and legislation from Brexit. And that had a number of different purposes. One of our interlocutors in interviews said, we could not afford to allow Brexit pollute everything in the EU. Secondly, they couldn't afford to allow Brexit become the dominant focus of the EU for the next 2, 3, 4 years. So they also then opted for the insulation of Brexit, single train tracks. I call it into the sidings. But they also, if you remember, opened the Bratislava strategic leadership agenda. In other words, there's a positive thing that goes with all this negative thing. And again, speed was, the EU responded with extraordinary speed here. Within 1 week, the Council Secretariat had created a special Council task force on Brexit, chaired by the former chef de cabinet Van Rompuy's former chef de cabinet Didier Suez. And that was an initial attempt to ensure that the Council would have the internal organizational capacity to deal with Brexit, that it would be able to handle it as an institution. And the SecGen of the Council was extremely active in this very early phase in organizing for Brexit. But of course, if the Council was organizing for Brexit, so too were the other side of the House in the Parlement. And by July, Juncker had appointed Barnier as the chief negotiator of the EU and head of Task Force 50. And the appointment of Barnier served a number of different purposes. Firstly, he was an ex-commissioner, so he knew the House. Secondly, he had been an MEP. Thirdly, he'd been a national minister. And fourthly, he was French. And the latter mattered because, again, it was a signal to London, we're not appointing someone from those friendly countries that you think you have. In other words, he's not Dutch, he's not Danish, he's not Swedish, he's French. And of course, he had a lot of experience in financial services as well. So that was the signaling of Barnier to the outside world. But Juncker understood that he also needed to have someone in charge of this dossier that the capitals and the heads of state would accept and would trust. If it had been as it could have been, the Director General of DG Trade, this simply would not have worked given the salience of what was at issue. So, Council Task Force, Commission Task Force. Then, of course, the European Parliament, a special internal European Parliament grouping. So there was seamless collaboration across the Council and the Commission and the Parliament, and they acted as a collective power in these negotiations. There was a high level of trust, and there was a constant daily, weekly engagement of all of the relevant actors to make sure that everyone stayed on the same page. And what this did was it transformed the rhetoric of unity into unity as a practice norm for the negotiations, where the participants began to congratulate themselves on being unified, which further reinforced unity. There was also very seamless collaboration between the Council, the permanent representations, and the capitals. The Sherpas played an extremely important role, as did the Perm Reps and the Brexit coordinators in every Perm Rep. So again, seamless. And unlike the Council Task Force and the Council Working Party on Brexit was chaired by a permanent Council official, Didier Sauwys, not the rotating presidency. So the other thing that really mattered here was that it was officials, permanent officials in the institutions really played an extremely important role. And then they molded and melded the member states. Of course, Brexit was Chefsache. It was the European Council in their conclusions from the beginning said, we will remain seized of this dossier. And of course, by being seized, they're saying this is our business. Other elements of the management or the Barnier method or the governance model was transparency. Say everything to everyone every day. The second was it was very deliberative. All of the institutions took great care to understand what this might mean and drew on the knowledge available to them in the institutions. So there was a meticulous analysis of the entire acquis and what Brexit might mean. And then there was a pedagogical element whereby literally there were seminars. I call it negotiation by PowerPoint. There were seminars from all of the principal member states to make sure that everyone stayed on the same page. So it was deliberative, it was pedagogical, and it was knowledge driven. And from the beginning, the EU was master of the text, which, as we all know in negotiations, is very important. Moving on to the negotiations, these were extremely tough negotiations. They were tough because from an EU perspective, it was lose-lose. The EU did not want Brexit. The EU didn't see any upside to Brexit. And of course, it was not like people say it was accession in reverse. I don't think that's a useful analogy. It was more like the secession of a state, at the division of a state. So the withdrawal agreement, there was the EU used time, and it used its negotiating leverage to basically extract from the UK what it wanted on the three most significant subjects: the budget, citizens, and the Northern Ireland, the border on the island of Ireland. It used time ruthlessly. Sufficient progress had to be made in the negotiations before they'd move on to either transition or to the future relationship. By far the most difficult issue in those negotiations was the border on the island of Ireland, and it remains the impossible problem in Brexit. There was a distinct difference between May and Johnson. May desperately tried, so she established very clear red lines and then desperately tried to move back from them. But by the time the withdrawal agreement was finalized, the May one, she was completely busted as a political leader. She was unlikely to ever get that through the House of Commons, although she became very, very close. And inevitably then, she lost power and Johnson came in. Johnson was very different. He wanted to get Brexit done at any cost, and he was prepared he wanted a change in her withdrawal agreement because he had basically voted against her, and that was the backstop for Northern Ireland was replaced by the protocol on Northern Ireland. And after that, he drove it through the House of Commons. The TCA negotiations are remarkable in that they took from March 20 to the 24th of December 2020. So very quick. But most people I've interviewed say that there was the three issues that were still outstanding in December 2020 were the three tough issues at the beginning. In other words, there was progress on all the stuff that was easy to make progress on from the beginning, but there were three very tough nuts to crack, and that really only started to happen about the 22nd of October, and some say even into November. In other words, there was frenetic negotiations in at least the last 4 to 5 weeks. They were negotiating all the time. And the only break in negotiation, I was told, was when people got on the Eurostar go in either direction. What were the tough issues? Firstly, governance, because the United Kingdom was insistent that this was under public international law. There could be no pollution from a British point of view of European law in the TCA. The British wanted multiple sectoral deals and no one overarching deal. And the EU was simply not prepared to offer them anything like Switzerland. The EU had learned from the multiple deals with the Swiss that they're difficult to manage. You never have horizontal overview, and the governance is extremely difficult. The British began to concede on governance in November, but the two other issues, fisheries and LPF, went right to the wire. In fact, apparently there were 2 European member states, France and Denmark, were holding out as late as the 23rd, early 24th of December on fish. And then, which is extraordinary given that fish is such a small part of the economies of both. But remember, for Macron, with an election coming up, there are votes in fish. And for the Danes, 50% of their fish comes from the North Sea, from British waters. So fish was emotive, and fish has always been problematic. In every single EU accession treaty involving coastal states, fisheries has been extremely difficult, and in fact is one of the reasons why Norway is not a member state of the EU. And then the famous level playing field negotiations. So the EU was absolutely insistent that the UK does not get zero tariff, zero quota trade without LPF conditions. And here, basically the EU drafted what they wanted and the British negotiated them down. But the British could not and would not have got an agreement without it. The EU would have walked rather than have a treaty without LPF, and in my view, correctly. But we've now ended up with an extraordinary set of legal and governance mechanisms on LPF, which both sides would prefer were never tested, but I suspect they will be tested. But apparently, the British negotiators spent months lecturing the EU negotiators on the no need for LPF and gaming one way or the other. They did reach an agreement. I suspect that the Biden election in November was extremely important in the end game of Brexit, in the end game of the TCA, because it meant that the British had to concede. Now, if I've gone over my 20 minutes, please stop me, because I wasn't watching time. Or I've two more slides. Should I continue?
No worries. Please continue, Bridget, please.
Okay. So Brexit outcomes. We've ended up with the hardest of hard Brexits and a very thin deal that's not at all appropriate to a country like the United Kingdom, which is geographically close to the EU. In other words, Canada, the UK is not Canada, but has a Canada-type deal. Secondly, there's a very fractious and poor relationship with the United Kingdom now, and it's unclear to me how that improves. And if I were asked to, what were the two factors that impacted most on the outcome that we've arrived at, I would say it was a clash of red lines and a clash of sovereignty practices. So the red lines on both sides were very red. The EU said there has to be a rights and obligations balance, no cherry picking, single market indivisible, and autonomy of the EU legal and decision-making system. That meant once the UK opted to exit the single market and the customs union and wanted the freedom to diverge, apparently the test of everything, one of our interviewers said it was like good old communist times when there was a political watcher in the room for the British, and I have the name, but the role of this commissar was to make sure that the sovereignty test was passed. In other words, that Boris Johnson could go to the House of Commons and say, our sovereignty is not limited. And of course, the no EU law. So if you put those two sets of hard lines side by side, then the only option was a very thin deal indeed. But I think it's also, and that's the chapter I sent on, important to look at the clash of models, because ideas and ideals help explain the Brexit outcome more than material interest from a UK perspective. And I would draw the distinction between sovereignty as an idea, concept, and as a practice. And I find so what the UK wanted was a very absolutist 19th, early 20th century vision of sovereignty. The emphasis on the UK as an independent state, an independent coastal state. We will take back control of our money, our borders, and our waters, and that freedom to diverge. Whereas the EU practice of sovereignty is that you share sovereignty, pool sovereignty, and hence are stronger. And it is these are incompatible practices. If the British want this absolutist view of sovereignty, then it is incompatible with the EU model of sovereignty practice. And I think that even at a deeper level, there certainly was among some who negotiated on the part of the British, including David Frost, they found it extremely difficult to acknowledge the legitimacy as a model of sovereignty practice. David Frost constantly referred in a very disparaging way to the EU to Barnier as your international organization or your organization. He couldn't bring himself to say the European Union. And if you pick up on, Barnier gave a speech in the last 2 weeks where he reflected a little, and of course his book is coming out, he reflected a little on his relationship with Frost. It was extremely poor. Not, in other words, at a personal level, there was no sharing of minds, there was no informality. And that again is coming across in my interviews, that whereas with the May people, there had been a level of trust and a level of engagement, with the Frost team, there was very little sense of engagement or commonality in their shared negotiations. So it was a very difficult negotiation. And again, I have been surprised at the tone that I am hearing from people who were in that room. This was a very tough, bruising encounter. And of course, it's not over yet, because this is a very unstable relationship and a very unstable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Laffan. I immediately give the floor to Professor Christensen.
Thanks, Eduardo, and the others for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's a fantastic event that you're organizing, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor, but also a huge challenge to speak after Bridget. It was very nice in your introduction, Eduardo, to what you said, but clearly there's only one giant here, and indeed Bridget is a pro on Brexit, as many other things, and I feel very much like an amateur. And anyway, I will also try to add something to what has been said. It was very nice of Bridget to share with me, and I think also with the others, her draft chapter, or the chapter of her forthcoming book. And that was, again, an amazing insight into what has happened. That allowed me also to maybe move in a slightly different direction in my comments, not at all as clinical and specific in the analysis as what we have just heard. But I want to maybe touch on four different items. So if I have my 20 minutes, maybe I hope to stick to 5 minutes on each of the four things. The first two of which are sort of reflections, not at all disagreements with what Bridget has said, but maybe some further thoughts on two aspects. The first one is the whole concept of sovereignty, and especially how that has played out in the Brexit debate, and specifically how that has played out in the UK context. Secondly, on the rationality of the entire process of these cost and benefit calculations. And then thirdly, and fourthly, I want to say a few words about the impact since it happened. So whereas I think from Bridget we got an excellent analysis of the negotiations, maybe I can offer a bit of a look forward in terms of what has happened since, in terms of impact on on the EU, and I want to divide that between an internal and an external perspective. But starting with this emphasis on sovereignty that Bridget both started and also ended up with, I think that's extremely valuable to upgrade our attention on that. It's incidentally also something that in Italy is now has become part of the Italian discourse on the EU, the whole sovereigntist position, something I don't think we had 5 years ago. So there's a wider attention now to the whole idea of sovereignty. My argument here is the following, that it is of course true that in a sense there was a clash of different conceptions of sovereignty, but beyond that one could perhaps argue that the UK always had a very troubled relationship with sovereignty, and I just want to give a few examples of that. Devolution is one point. I was a little surprised that Bridget did not say that much about Northern Ireland. It's surely something that will come up in the discussion, but if we understand sovereignty as a meaningful concept rather than a political practice or discourse, but as a concept, I understand it to mean that there is a single authority within a certain territory and none beyond it. And in that sense, I think it's highly problematic what arrangement we now have in Northern Ireland in terms of who's actually in charge there. One can extend that to Scotland as well. I mean, it might well be that Scotland is ultimately under the British government, but of course it has a high degree of self-development. Wales, where I lived 7 years, is again a particular territory, but not nearly as obviously problematic as Northern Ireland, Scotland. The whole problem of devolution, the way in which devolution is very often problematic in the UK political context, is a sign that Britain hasn't come quite to grips with sovereignty over its own territory. With is it actually a hierarchical arrangement, or is it a union of different states? Another aspect is the role of the courts, the independence, if you want, of the judiciary, the role of judicial review of executive orders, and so on. And it was remarkable, if not hair-raising, how during the time after the referendum, the government ended up repeatedly in the courts in order to have its policies struck down. So there has been a legal battle, as it were, between the executive and the judiciary in the UK, which also makes it difficult to fully understand who's actually in charge. Parliamentary sovereignty, coming to that, I mean, the whole idea of whether Parliament is sovereign. I mean, the whole Brexit debate was supposedly about taking back control for the British Parliament. But then again, much of what happened afterwards was actually about disempowering the Parliament. There was even this rather infamous period of prorogation, where one could argue that the government abused its executive privilege to disempower, to disenfranchise the House of Westminster, supposedly the mother of all parliaments. Not to mention the House of Lords, which again is a very particular institution, and it's somewhat under threat also by the government. So, again, the wider issue here is actually about the absence of a written constitution, the absence of a clear set of powers which would clearly delineate who's in charge of what, and where who's the final arbiter in this. There's of course also an international dimension to that, which is, for example, illustrated also by the British debate about leaving the European Charter of Human Rights. And then ultimately that brings me to the European Union. So the membership in the European Union, sharing power with a supranational organization of that nature, is, one could argue, fundamentally difficult for a polity like the British that has so many difficulties sharing power also internally. And comparing that with the many federal states we have around the world, and indeed in the European Union itself, where it's completely normal to share power. So there is indeed a British exceptionalism about sovereignty, but it goes beyond, I think, just the positioning in the Brexit negotiation. It's a more fundamental, one could even say, constitutive aspect of the British political system. All right, that was already more than 5 minutes. I move on to the issue of how rational things were, or rather, I want to make the argument that things are not as rational as I think Bridget described them. Not that I would disagree with anything that was said, but beyond the actual negotiations and even beyond the political circles, where people perhaps do cost-benefit calculations, have positions that they then try to defend and so on. If we look at the wider debate, I'm talking now essentially about the UK, but we can also maybe look elsewhere. The entire debate about Brexit, one could really argue that people have lost their senses to some extent. It's become highly emotional, to some extent, highly irrational in terms of how things are being debated. Things like to be a leaver or to be a remainer or to be a remoaner or whatever have become really, ideological imprints. It's not anymore a choice that you make. It's something that you are. You're defined as such, and it's almost an ethnic divide that has developed in the UK. To some extent, it's a religious conflict. Are you for or against Brexit? Are you with us or with them? It is a schism in the British society. One would hope that over time will diminish, but in fact, anything that happened since the TCA has come into force has only illustrated how this is being carried forward. What was perhaps at a time a sort of emotional debate that divided the country has now become really a sort of a standard pattern of discourse in the public eye, in the social media, in the traditional media, and so on. And it coincides, of course, somewhat with other developments that tie quite well in with that, namely the whole contestation of expertise, that we don't believe in science anymore as such, that we question the elites, populism, obviously much more broadly than that. The spread of misinformation, whether it's by foreign powers, whether it's by internal groups and so on. The comfort that we increasingly have in political life with lying, it's quite remarkable. And all of this, really the science denying, the misinformation, the lying, and so on, all of that has come to the fore also during the Brexit debate, and has tied in with this whole removal of reason and replacement of reason with emotion, as I would say. So we end up really in a place in which the public debate is removed from rationality, from reality, and has become really an ideological fundamentalist conflict between two different sides where facts matter increasingly less. That is not to say, of course, that the manner in which negotiations occurred were not driven by interests. The players, whether it's May fighting for political survival, whether it's Johnson and his ego, whether it's the media who want to sell as much as possible their papers, whether it's hedge funds who want to be deregulated. Surely there are a lot of interests also at play. I'm not denying that for one moment. But actually, if you think about it, it's quite remarkable how absent, in general, economic interests that we often think in political analysis are so crucial, how absent they have been from decision making, how none of the major sectoral interest groups in the UK have come down hard on the government for their clearly not the 20% economic interest that Bridget mentioned, and how that has been replaced by this noise about people just wanting independence and the like. So my bottom line there is, this is really a moment of significant irrationality that we observe here, and something that I think questions also a bit how we analyze politics. Okay, moving forward to impact on the EU and some brief comments on that. On the internal side, I mean, I can really keep it short because that was covered to some extent by Bridget, and I would fully agree. I think all these doomsayers that we had right after the referendum, that this is potentially the end of the EU and so on, have been proven wrong. Indeed, one could argue slightly provocatively that Brexit turned out to be a huge opportunity for the EU to demonstrate its unity or to create a degree of unity that wasn't there before. At the popular level, I think it's fairly well established now that right after Brexit and presumably related to Brexit, public support for EU membership has gone up across the board in every other EU member state. The EU, as Bridget demonstrated, has maintained extraordinary unity during the negotiations, has been very solid and consistent in defending its red lines, defending its vulnerable member states like the Republic of Ireland, and ultimately one could argue that it was a loss-loss result always going to be, but that in that context the EU got rather a lot out of the final agreement compared to what the UK has lost. One could also presume that the UK, having always been the awkward partner, always being a veto player, would make, the absence of the UK would make life easier for the other 27, and that was something I believed initially, that, and I'm sure many in France and elsewhere, sort of good riddance type thinking about the UK, but that's of course overshadowed by many of the other more important problems the EU has. Again, I fully agree with Bridget. Brexit is not really a huge problem for the EU. It's not good for sure, but it's not an existentialist crisis. What is a potential existentialist crisis is our rule of law issue that we have with Hungary and Poland and probably other member states in the future that we don't seem to be able to get a grip on. Our difficulty to come to a common position on migration, one of the key issues probably for the entire century that we have to face. The global crisis of multilateralism under Trump and so on, that was more important than Brexit over this whole period. And now, of course, the pandemic that one has to deal with. And I would say across all of these, the EU institutions haven't come out very glorious in terms of their performance. It's not really been a great performance by the EU or by the Brussels institutions in particular, and that sort of negates a bit any sort of credit one would give them for having managed Brexit so well. It's more important to manage the pandemic well than to manage Brexit well, you could argue, and they haven't done that. So in a sense, we lost something there, and that brings me to the external side, where again one could open up a similar sort of calculation and say there's clearly a cost of Brexit to the EU in terms of its international standing. We lost one of the top 3 member states. We lost a medium-sized power that had significant military capabilities, that is a nuclear power, that is a UN Security Council permanent member, that has a huge network in the Commonwealth around the world, and so on and so on. To lose that a member state is clearly a blow to the EU in reputation and capability terms. The UK has special relationships with the United States, with countries like India and others, that are now lost to the EU as a result. So that's clearly not good, from an EU perspective. But on the other hand, you could again say, well, foreign policy above all is a consensual game where you need everybody on board, and the UK was always going to be difficult there. Indeed, it's been remarkable how much more has been possible. If you think of permanent structured cooperation, the whole less resistance now to common military structures, a more, let's say, optimistic debate about strategic autonomy, however utopian that may be ultimately, but at least it's something easier now to talk about, and so on. But again, it's actually not that significant that it might be easier to do these things without the British, because ultimately there's so many other things going on. On the plus side, with Biden elected, multilateralism is perhaps back on track somewhat. NATO anyway remains, however brain dead we might think it is, it remains and provides still a binding force for the UK and the EU. More generally, the West is in some sort of fight for survival against other powers, be it Russia or China, and that also pushes the EU and the UK still together. So even there, in the broader sense of foreign policy, yes, there are some losses, there are some gains, but ultimately the world continues to turn. And also in foreign policy terms, EU institutions have not really done a great job lately. If you just think about Borrell's performance in Moscow recently, and then the Sofa Gate just now in Ankara. I mean, you can see how the EU is, I mean, these are symbolic moments, but you can see how the EU is at a loss in the context of multipolarity and great power politics. The EU is not very well made for that. And even if one would assume it's fitter now without the UK as a break, it lacks some of the structural capabilities that would otherwise perhaps make it a stronger player. So not to end on a whimper, but ultimately, I think the impact on the EU, both internally and externally, is not hugely different. Of course, that is a picture that maybe depends a bit on different sectors, on different moments, and obviously it's not even across the member states either. But nevertheless, it's clearly not the end of the world. So my final word is that I'm more concerned really about the backward-looking developments we have with regard to things like science and reason and facts in politics. I think those are more the victims of what has happened than the survival of the EU as such. Okay, I leave it there and hope we can have a discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Thank you both for your insightful and broad presentations, which, by the way, touch upon several of the classes that we had in this school and which we will have tomorrow. For instance, we will talk about the rule of law. So, Thomas, your points on the rule of law will be the subject matter of tomorrow's classes. Without further ado, let me open the floor and collect a few questions from our audience. Alessandra Carraro first, and then if you raise your hands after Alessandra, we'll collect other questions. Please, Alessandra, just go on.
Thank you, and thank you, professors, for the presentations. I wanted to ask to Professor Laffan, she mentioned briefly May's backstop and Johnson's protocol, so I wanted to ask what are the differences between the two, if there are any? And then I wanted to ask perhaps to both, if we can say that the Brexit affair is settled by now, at least from an EU perspective, you know, except for some adjustments that might be required anytime soon, but overall, is it settled from our perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Is anyone else willing to ask any question right now, or shall I give the floor to our guest? Okay, let's give the floor back to Bridget Laffan first and Thomas Christensen later.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra. Two great questions. So let me begin first. Is Brexit settled? No. This is a very unstable relationship now. There are very serious issues about the intent of the United Kingdom to implement, particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol, the withdrawal agreement. But there's also the UK itself still hasn't reached a level of organisation about its borders to properly govern what's happening. And of course, we also now see a very high level of friction on economic and human exchange between the UK and the rest of Europe. So Brexit is not settled. And interestingly, the EU has organised itself to be extremely vigilant about the implementation and operation of these two treaties. The Commission has set up a horizontal unit within the Secretariat General to make sure that everything that happens in this agreement gets a horizontal screening. And in the Council, the unit that will deal with it in the Council again is horizontal and is part of the Council Institutional Directorate and not its external directorate. So the member states and the EU institutions are going to be extremely vigilant. Also, in terms of settled, unsettled, the governance, apart from the fact that the TCA has not been finally ratified, it's provisional ratification, but the whole governance regime has to be established with all of the committees and all of that. I think it's settled in one sense, in that there is no appetite to reopen these treaties now. So in that sense, the question is how to work what is there rather than how to begin to tackle some of the problems, the frictions. And in my view, nothing can be done about the frictions until you have a new government in the United Kingdom. As long as you have an ideologically driven sovereignty first government in London, then it's going to be extremely difficult. And of course, the other point I should make is that inbuilt in the TCA are review clauses. There's a review clause on the deal overall. There's lots of review clauses on different elements. So in my view, this is the EU and UK are embarking on a new post-divorce relationship, and they don't like each other very much at the moment. They're still fighting about the children. So I think that that's to your first question. On the May backstop and the protocol on Northern Ireland, there were a number of important differences. Firstly, May had got the EU to agree to an all-UK customs union, which would have dramatically decreased the friction GB Northern Ireland, but also reduced the friction UK-EU. So that's gone. Secondly, the protocol, the May backstop, had a commitment by the EU to take very seriously alternative arrangements. In other words, to look at technology and trusted trader schemes and all of that. And the backstop was regarded as an insurance. In other words, it might not have to be used. Whereas what Johnson offered was a border in the Irish Sea for certain issues, checks on the Irish Sea for certain issues, and it's permanent, other than it's dependent on the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2024 with rolling consent thereafter. So on the sovereignty issue, Johnson privileged GB sovereignty rather than UK sovereignty, and he took a deliberate decision to do so. Now, did he take a deliberate decision to do so, thinking, well, we really won't have to implement this, or we will salami slice this, and so in the end we will dilute the Northern Ireland Protocol? It's extremely unstable and very dangerous, and we have seen in the last 2 weeks a return of violence to the streets of Northern Ireland. There is no good solution for Northern Ireland or the island of Ireland. This has really undermined the faith of the loyalist community, but a border has to go somewhere. And so the impossible trilemma of Brexit finds its most acute expression in Northern Ireland, the most vulnerable part of the United Kingdom. And for me, and this is I'm an Irish citizen, is how anyone could take risks with peace on the island of Ireland given 30 years of a low-grade civil war. Beggars belief for something mythical and, as Thomas described, almost irrational in terms of ideology.
Yeah, thanks, Alessandra. Little to add from my perspective. Obviously, I also don't see this as a settled issue. Many of the key decisions, in a sense, have been postponed. I mean, some doors have been closed, at least for now, but there's also nothing to say that that they may not be reopened again in the future. I mean, we now know that the EU is able to move in both directions. It's able to manage accessions, but it's also able to manage secessions, as it were. And I personally don't believe it, but I like this this thing that some people say, you know, let the British experience being outside for a while and then come back 10 years and readmit them without the special budgetary rebate that they had and other opt-outs and so on. Who knows? But I mean, clearly, history is not as an end, and more importantly, as Bridget just said, some of the key issues are really sort of bubbling not far from the surface. I mean, also linking that to the previous discussion about sovereignty, whether it has been regained or not. I mean, the monitoring that has now to take place on a continuous basis, both about what happens in Northern Ireland at both borders, the Irish Sea border and the intra-Irish border, and the monitoring that has to take place about a level playing field, about competition policy and so on. These are both potentially huge intrusions into British or UK sovereignty. I would probably on balance subscribe to the conspiracy theory that the British government agreed to these things in knowledge that they would attempt to contravene these rules and not be able to be held to account for them. And I think it is generally going to be a struggle for the EU to impose itself on, let's say, you know, customs controls between the UK mainland and Northern Ireland. I think that's something inherently difficult, both technically and politically, for the EU to be seen there, you know, within the British territory to impose controls without people on the ground and without much legitimacy. You know, so I think that is potentially quite difficult. You know, I think court cases is only a matter of time. And again, it's ironic how much the British have talked about getting rid of the ECJ, and ultimately it may well end up again in the ECJ and so on. And it's also maybe ironic, since you know, when you ask about are things settled, it's ironic if we think about the European Economic Area, the EEA, you know, which was a thing that was cooked up after the Norway referendum. That seemed like a very provisional and unstable creation when it was first created. But it's been, you know, around for almost 20 years now with hardly any problems, and it's doing its job. It has its, you know, flaws as well, but it is a very settled arrangement between Norway and the EU that would have been open to the UK had they chosen to go down that path, you know. So I think it's ironic that in the search for some sort of independence and finality, the British ultimately ended up with something which is much more fragile and unfinished.
Thank you. So I'm collecting a few questions since I see some hands raised, and then I will change the order to give the floor first to Thomas Christensen and then to Bridget Laffan, also because Thomas may need to leave us slightly earlier, and so we may you know, carry on in case we Bridget with last answers. So Adam first, then Christian, Alexandra, and Matteo, finally. Adam, please.
Okay, so this is to both of you, but perhaps a bit more to Professor Laffan. Basically speaking, I'm curious to, okay, there's a few events that are going on here. And you mentioned that Froth, for example, in the negotiations, couldn't even say the European Union, like as a separate entity that is its own thing. And Professor Christensen, you brought in this lack of rationality, this ideology concept. So after this, there were two events that stuck out to me very strongly. In the fishery discussions, the British deployed frigates, like warships, in their seas in order to protect against European fishermen, which was an incredibly provocative thing that I saw occur. And then in 2021, they refused to give diplomatic status to European diplomats on an equal footing with certain member states. And I'm curious as to your perspectives, both of you. as to what point Britain sort of crosses a certain line to where they have to be considered something of a destabilizing factor in European integrity itself. Like, at what point do we make that call? I'm very curious as to your perspectives on that. And what do you do as a result? What can the European Union do? What should it do?
Christian?
Yes. I wanted to ask if, since during the pandemic, we have seen a rising importance of the state of the government, and so a kind of diffusion of the idea that the state is important, maybe in many fields of our life, and especially in the economy, if a possible loss for the EU can be the strong liberal mindset of British MPs and other representatives. And another question was if Brexit can be seen as the only long-lasting effect of the wave, of the populist wave we have experienced, for example, with Donald Trump in United States, or we have experienced in these years in Italy, but which seem like to have a step back. Thanks.
Thanks, Christian. Alexandra.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have a question for Professor Laffan. At the beginning, you mentioned the security issue, and it is possible that after the Brexit, the EU will develop its CSDP and to reinforce the PESCO instrument. Thank you.
And finally, Matteo.
Thank you. I have a question for both. Do you think that there could be a connection between the unity found by member states in dealing with the Brexit issue and the solidarity achieved in dealing with the pandemic with the Recovery Fund and Next Generation EU and the other programs?
Thanks, Matteo. So we have collected all questions. Thomas, Christensen.
I didn't quite catch Matteo's question. Can you say that again, Matteo?
No, I understand by the presentation of the Professor Laffan that in Brexit we have seen a strong unity by the member state in dealing with the issue of Brexit. I see a connection, a temporal connection with how at last we are dealing with the pandemic economic problem in achieving an agreement on the EU multi-annual framework and the recovery fund. I don't know, maybe it's not.
Okay, thanks, Matteo. Sorry, just one point, if I may. If you want to ask a question to Thomas Christensen, that's your last chance. So please, if you have any curiosity or anything you want to address to him specifically, please raise your hand. Okay, looking around. Right, Thomas, I give you the floor.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the questions. I try and keep it short. I mean, on the last one, it's an interesting point. I would consider that a fairly optimistic understanding of what happened with the EU budget and decision making during the pandemic more generally. Yes, you know, on the one hand, they did achieve eventually agreement on that, but it's far from being implemented. As you probably know, it's currently stuck in Karlsruhe in the infamous German Constitutional Court. That makes me somewhat shiver, because the Constitutional Court is also a fairly Eurosceptic player in the process. And I thought the early celebrations of a Hamiltonian moment were a bit premature. You know, we have to really see what programs member states come up with, how these are being implemented. And this is not just money that's going to flow. It's a huge multi-annual implementation project that requires quite a lot of cooperation from all sides. And even if that was a fairly strong statement of solidarity and unity, I think it's somewhat overshadowed by many other statements of lack of solidarity and lack of unity, because border controls have gone up to a large extent. I mean, to many ways, in many ways, we have vaccine nationalism now, perhaps essentially outside the EU, but potentially also inside. You maybe follow the games that Austria is playing about getting more vaccines. There's a lot of bickering. There's a lot of disagreement. Incidentally, it's not just in the EU. I mean, as a German, I also observe how many internal struggles there have been inside member states. The same, probably the case in Italy. We have seen the same also from the US and the UK. So, I mean, the pandemic really has put people put at loggerheads with one another. It's not really a great moment for unity, as far as I can see it. And to some extent, perhaps a missed opportunity. Like I said, the European institutions, the Commission, didn't come out very well out of both the initial handling of the health crisis and then the vaccine negotiations and so on. I'm not saying it could have been much better, but it certainly didn't come across as very effective. So, for me, the pandemic is not a huge success story for the EU from where we are right now. I hope I'm wrong. On the first question, what I would call symbolic politics. I mean, putting warships, they didn't really protect the fish with the warships. And then this thing about not according embassy status to the EU delegation. I mean, for me, that's symbolic politics. It fits into this narrative that I mentioned about this being more religious struggle or an ideological struggle than really a rational set of negotiations. I mean, on fish, to be honest, it is an environmental crisis also waiting to happen, not in the North Sea necessarily, but globally. And I wish there were more warships protecting fish. But that is not really what happened here. I think here it's essentially really British politics and to some extent the British mainstream media really using the EU in order to shore up some sort of emotional support. I don't see that as much more than that. In return, one could say that the EU, or at least the common institutions, have been fairly sober in their response. And one could perhaps debate, and this will not go away. This is also, in a sense, relating to what happened in Ankara and elsewhere. To what extent the EU is fit to play the game of states, as it were? To what extent the EU can be an effective player in a world in which I think states and especially great powers are becoming more important again after a period in which perhaps governance regimes to some extent have eclipsed them. So the EU, I think, is facing fundamental problems there, but that's really not specific to Brexit. It's much more general about the nature of international politics and how the EU is not really at home in them. Finally, this loss of British liberalism in international trade. If I understand the question correctly, yes, I think traditionally that was always a sort of internal cleavage, as it were, between the more liberal free marketeers, to which Britain clearly was a leader, and then the more protectionist mercantilist forces, a la France or perhaps the Mediterranean countries, and Germany somewhat in between. And yes, of course, on the face of it, you would say, well, with Britain out, and Macron and so on in the ascendancy, you would say, well, clearly that is a blow to liberal, to the EU's position vis-a-vis liberal trade. However, one just has to recognize for a moment that what Brexit constitutes, among everything else, is the biggest ever backward move in trade liberalization that we've had since 1945. I mean, the history since 1945 was one of gradual trade liberalization around the world that continued during the whole era of decolonization, that continued during the opening of China, which ultimately joined the WTO. It had its ups and downs, if you want. It was clearly not a linear process, and it's been problematic, especially in the last decade. But there's been no case like this where a country chooses itself to cut itself off from its largest market, 60% of its market, voluntarily by reimposing border controls and non-tariff barriers in the way that this has happened. This puts a huge question mark over this traditional image we have of Britain as a free market economy. Perhaps this was a one-off, and it was just on this occasion that, like I argued, religion or ideology won over, or the belief in sovereignty, like Bridget said, won over economic interest. But it could also be that there's a fundamental transformation in the way in which Britain behaves, because while they are shopping around a bit desperately for trade agreements in the rest of the world, they're not making much progress with that either. And this increasingly religious belief, and we have to protect our sovereignty, also makes it more and more difficult to enter into trade agreements, which increasingly are agreements of a kind that do remove your power of control over your own economy, because it imposes on you international standards or regimes, monitoring and dispute settlement mechanisms that are then out of your control. So, for me, there's a bit of a question mark whether Britain is still really as liberal as it traditionally has been. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Thomas. And of course, if at some point you have to go, we're really thankful for your contribution and the time you've given us.
Thanks. I will leave quietly at past. So just keep going if you need. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank
Thomas.
You. Bridget.
So on the frigates and Adam's question on the frigates and diplomatic status, that's silly bugger politics. I mean, that's just playing the game. But can I say on fish that the EU has stitched the UK on fish? Why? Because the British wanted all their waters back and effectively annual negotiations in terms of the allowable catch for the EU fleets. What has happened is the EU has given back on a phase basis 25% of the 27 catch. Well, it's not, because obviously the Austrians don't catch fish, but they've given back 25%. And after that, it becomes annual. But the EU has decided that's it. It's not offering to give more after 2025. And in order to make sure there's a cost to the British, if that's what they want, they have made a horizontal link to the energy market. So if the British, in the annual allocation of quota after 2025, decide to be difficult, then the EU has a retaliatory capacity on energy. So it's already done. So my view is that very quietly, the British government will say to the fishermen, you've got 25% of the catch back, by which time, and it's already happened, the fishermen will know that there's a problem here because they get more catch, but they've no market. Then they have a problem. And on the diplomatic status, 142 states across the world give the EU this diplomatic status. London should just cop on and grow up. But as long as Dominic Raab is in the Foreign Office, that's not going to happen. He's not very bright, and he's also an ideologue. On the liberal, I think that's, I think Thomas gave a very nuanced answer to that. I would simply add that across the world in trade, there is a protectionist turn. And also, one of the things the pandemic highlighted was that one should be extremely careful on supply chains for essential goods. And so no part of the world wants to be caught out again at having only one or two suppliers of PPE or certain medical products. So I think that the whole debate about the open strategic autonomy is a battle across the member states, but also in the Commission between, say, DG Trade and some of the others. But I do think that the EU, particularly on trade, it's strengthened its trade defense mechanisms already, and that's about China, and that's what it should do. Also, across the member states, the Dutch have tried to move into the UK policy space and tried to become the next large state in the EU post, another large state in the EU post-Brexit. So I think that it's a contested space, the whole protectionism, openness, but it's also not just to do with Brexit. It's much bigger. As to whether Brexit is the last political event driven by the populist wave, I don't think so. I think the both fragmentation of politics, volatility in politics, and volatility in terms of political behavior suggests that we are wise not to make any predictions on on 5 years plus in this matter. On Alexandra, on will the EU strengthen CSDP and PESCO? Yes, it already is. And it's certainly, that's not just that Brexit, in my view, is not the issue here. Rather, it's the trauma of Trump and the future of NATO. Obviously, Biden provides an opportunity for a reset of multilateralism in the world. But as we know, Trumpism has not gone away. And regardless, given what's happening in the Pacific, the EU has got to be more attentive to its own security for all sorts of reasons. On the pandemic, so here I think I probably differ with Thomas. So how can we read the pandemic? It's, again, we have to be careful because we're reading it when we're in the middle of it. But I would say that I observed a lot of learning in the EU from the Eurozone crisis. The ECB moved immediately. It didn't take 3 years. In terms of policy instruments, there was EFSF, ESM, the fiscal treaty, a lot of intergovernmental treaties, whereas there was, in the pandemic, a resort to the supranational instruments, no differentiated integration, in other words, the RRF and the MFF. And it's not a Hamiltonian moment, but it has Hamiltonian potential. Why do I say this? These loans will have to be repaid as up to about 2058. That's an extremely long time. And in order to repay it, it will have to come from the EU budget, which means there will have to be new own resources in the EU budget. And the only new own resources, it can't just be the member state key, in other words, member state contributions, it will have to be European level taxation. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be extremely difficult, very contested. But in my view, in the next 10 years, we will see the emergence of more EU-level own resources. I suspect if I were to look where it's most likely, I think the emissions trading system, a border carbon tax, these are the kinds of, so the emission trading system already exists, border carbon tax is coming. So I think that's where the Hamiltonian moment is. And then if, and this is a big if a virtuous cycle can be made of the common borrowing, and if it supports the emergence of a European capital markets, which is shorthand for a European safe asset, if that can happen, then it may be a mini Hamiltonian moment, but it is transformative. So I think the next, I wrote a book about the finances of the EU in '97, and I was never been tempted to rewrite it. I would be tempted if I weren't retiring in the next 10 years. I won't write it, but I would be tempted because I think there will be a lot of interesting politics in this over the next 10 years. And on the vaccine rollout and the vaccine nationalism, I think the only safe European stance was common procurement. Can we imagine, had there not been Commission-driven contracts or EU collective contracts on this? I think it would have been a disaster, where you would have 27 states fighting for a problematic supply of vaccines. And again, I think when the history of the period is written, the one big problem with the vaccine supply was AstraZeneca. And I simply don't know enough about contract law to know whether AstraZeneca has been really pernicious in its dealings with the UK and with the EU. In other words, one would like to know more about the contracts and whether or not, and that's not to say that there are not likely to be problems in those contracts from an EU perspective, but I think AstraZeneca it sold the same vaccines multiple times over, with protecting itself with lines in the contract that they would make their best efforts or whatever. Of course, now that there's domestic pressure on member states to get the vaccines out, we see the Sputnik and all of the Austrian Chancellor. We see all of this, but that's very predictable. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on European leaders to roll out those vaccines because it matters. So again, I'm not sure the pandemic has been quite the disaster that Thomas suggests, but it's when we're in the middle of it, it's difficult to judge, because we're suffering from with a moving target. Let me say one final thing, and that is that I think as scholars of integration, we haven't paid enough attention. There's a huge literature on the impact of crises on the EU. In my view, the EU has been formed and molded by those crises and is quite a different animal for the second decade of the 21st century than it was at the end of the 20th century. I think the EU has been hardened by crisis. I think it has the impact on the nature of the polity. I think we're probably not paying enough attention to. And I think it would be worth all your while reading Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times yesterday, when he, in a sense, was taking on the doomsayers, saying that the EU was much more resilient, was a resilient organization. And I think I'm on the resilient side of this disintegration argument. But I think, again, as scholars, we haven't paid enough attention to the sources of that resilience. And we should spend some of our time working on that, on going back up to those big polity questions about the EU at this juncture.
Thank you very much indeed also for detailing a research agenda, which is a very welcome suggestion indeed. Once again, I may take the chance to thank Thomas, since it is some minutes after 5:30, and before reopening the floor, I know he will leave quietly, but there is this chance. Thank you once more, Thomas, for joining us in this round table.
Thank you, and it's really been an honor. And again, thanks also to Bridget. I always learn so much from her. And just to be clear, I don't think it's a total disaster. I just think there's a bit of light and shadow, but fully agree with your assessment. Thank you all. Thank you, Eduardo, for the invitation, and good luck with the further summer school. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So we may take a last round of questions. If anyone has any comment or question, like Antonio, for instance, or anyone else, it's your last chance. So do exploit it. Angela too. Antonio, please go on. Then I'll move to Angela. In the meanwhile, if anyone has any other question, please, it's your turn. Antonio.
Yeah, it's a really quick question to Professor Laffan. It's about the domination of the Brexit debate in the Anglophone world on part of British media. A few days ago, I read an article on the Irish Times by an Irish journalist who complained about how most of the information and the narratives about the European Union and its relation to Brexit are actually coming from mostly British papers. So the British view is also the view that gets carried over to all the Anglophone parts of the world, the United States, Australia, India, and so on. And this really interested me, and I would like to ask Professor Laffan if this is a big enough issue, if there is like some sort of narrative stranglehold in Anglophone media when it comes to talking about Brexit and so on.
Thanks, Antonio. Angela.
All right, thank you very much. I would like first to ask, can you hear me? Because
Yes.
okay, all right, because I guess I have some problems with connection because I can't see you, but it's important that you can hear me. All right. I have a broader question and maybe a too ambitious one, but what I got the most from your whole presentation was this unity that in the end of the day, the European Union as a whole, so all the institutions together were able to show and to prove throughout the whole process of negotiations for during the Brexit. So I was wondering some thoughts of yours about maybe is there any link between the European Union being successful in these terms with Brexit and it being unsuccessful with other ongoing crises such as the rule of law one, the immigration crisis, that of course are completely different, have other factors to play. And yes, but just this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Adam, or sorry, first Christian, sorry, he was first in line.
I think Adam was first, but since you're taking all together, I think it's quite the same. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned the EU fiscal, you were talking about the economy after recovery plan, and I wanted to ask if this facility could, in a way, in future, of course, kind of force the member states to overcome their conflicts about the possibility of some shared fiscal policy or even a common shared debt. Thank you.
Adam?
I have a question about the European polity. It's a fascination, a proper fascination. Whenever we're looking at the European polity, do you suggest that we look at it more from a top-down model where we look at the elites and their identities within the European polity? Or do you think that it's more useful to look at the feelings of your standard European, your average citizen? Because I found that when working in international relations with this, it's very difficult to nail down the European polity, the European identity, and exactly where we should be looking. So,
thanks. I've seen there are a few other questions, but since it has may become a bit too much, I'll give the floor back to Professor Laffan, and in case we'll be back to the other questions.
Okay. Again, great questions. So Antonio, on the British media and the dominance of the British media in the Anglophone world, absolutely. There is, firstly, the British tabloid press has been relentlessly Eurosceptic, but also very reductionist and essentially carrying misinformation with delight about the EU. But I think it's not just the tabloid press. So I'm a student of The Economist, and the one thing I can guarantee is that whatever The Economist puts on its front page on the EU, it is wrong. Whatever prediction it makes is not going to happen. The very famous coffin in 1982, which said RIP EEC, and that was literally within 3 years of the Single European Act and the so I think because the EU is not easily comprehensible, we can't compare it to something, and it's not a scaled up version of a nation state, then there's a tendency to misread it. And so I think that's more general in the Anglo-Saxon. Again, if I were from Mars and had landed on Earth during the Eurozone crisis and had only listened to American economists, then I would have assumed that the euro would not be the money in my pocket today. But it is. So I think you're right. I think there is something there that also because, and this goes back to the Hamiltonian moment, because the EU is quasi-federal, but the model of federalism is much more akin to shared administration a la the Federal Republic of Germany than it is the United States of America, then again, there's a tendency to get the categories wrong. On the question, was the unity in Brexit a sign of success, that the EU was successful in maintaining unity on Brexit, but unsuccessful. I think there's a big distinction between Brexit, which was a collective issue for the remaining member states and the system, and what I would call internal politics. And one shouldn't expect on major questions of internal politics to have either unity or agreement. One would be astonished, because politics is all about disagreement and conflict management. One would be astonished if the EU, if there weren't pretty big cleavages within the EU. Now, interestingly, the example you give is immigration, and there's no doubt that the formal EU model, both of immigration and also then refugee and asylum, the Dublin Convention, are in need of repair. But it's impossible to repair them because immigration affects different countries very differently. And if you're in Denmark or in Denmark or in the Netherlands, you're very far away from being the first country of admission. So you're not going to want to change the Dublin Convention. So on the other hand, and this is the collective, the priority for Europe's leaders in 2015 and 16 was to bring down numbers. This was unstated, but if you look at what the politicians did as opposed to what they said, that was their priority. And did they succeed? Yes. How did they succeed? Because they couldn't organize internally and agree internally, they basically externalized the deal with Turkey. So to say that, in other words, be very careful not to accept what politicians say their priorities are. The EU dramatically reduced the numbers crossing the Mediterranean, which for the leaders was their goal at that stage. The EU will always have a challenge on migration because of the very big differences between income levels and prosperity on the two sides of the Mediterranean, and because of the poverty and conflict in lots of Africa and further afield. So immigration is not going to go away as a challenge. And of course, the EU needs a more sustainable policy on legal migration. It needs to reform, although I don't know how it can, the whole area of asylum and refugee and the Dublin Convention. But even with all of that, simply socioeconomic differences, life chances, and particularly now the climate crisis south of the MENA region, means that immigration is a challenge for the EU, for Europe, until we deal with the extraordinary inequalities between different parts of the world. It's not unlike the Mexican border into the United States. People want a better life and will move to try to have a better life. And if you have a lot of conflict, then people will flee conflict. And if any of us found ourselves and our families in these conditions, that's precisely what we would do. So immigration is always going to be very problematic, very challenging for the EU. Christian, on whether the RRF can become a fiscal instrument, I think the Eurozone needs a level of fiscal support, and it will get it one way or the other over the next cycle. And this RRF is what I would call almost the proof of concept. And one can see, and this is why it's so important the RRF works, if the recovery funding is well and wisely used and it generates more growth in Europe and at the same time provides a European safe asset, then there will be proof that it's worth doing. If, on the other hand, the RRF does not deliver, then it'll be extremely difficult to create that fiscal capacity. So the RRF is a big test. And of course, it's a particularly big test for Italy and for Spain, because they're the big countries and they're going to get most of it. And then finally, Adam, on the European polity, elites and public opinions, I think the nature of the EU, there's an inherent duality in the EU. It is, in its constitutive sense, it is both a union of states and a union of peoples. And it can't be one without the other. The union of states and the union of peoples have to be held in balance. And so the answer to your question is, it's not an either or. In order to understand the EU and the dynamic of European integration, you must pay attention to the agents, the elites, but also, of course, to public opinion, because Europe can't be forged without the people either. But it's that inherent tension between the union of states and peoples.
Thanks, Bridget, for these very deep answers. I knew that there were still a few questions. We don't want to abuse your time. I would ask students to be very specific, ask quick questions for a very final answer from Professor Laffan. I know that Francesco has been raising his physical hand for quite a while, so I'll certainly give the floor to Francesco and Giulia too, and Cristina. So please keep your time. Thank you. Francesco.
In the last weeks, I know that the EU raised like a fund, a reserve fund, in order to provide help to the sectors that will be hit more by the Brexit crisis, no? And I wanted to know if the British are doing something similar, and in particular, I would like to know if the academic institutions are doing something in order to help the European students that now are considered like all the others, and so they will have to pay the normal fees. Thank you.
Giulia.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my question is quite broad, general, and maybe we need also the next lessons to answer it. because it regards democracy. The point is, apart from thinking as the United Kingdom as a loser from Brexit or the European Union as a loser, isn't democracy the real loser in this case? Because what I mean, there was a referendum, and the referendum can be considered one of the most the highest point of democracy. But citizens were influenced by fake news, misinformation, and also external people. And I'm thinking particularly of the scandal of some years ago about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. So Trump, Steve Bannon, and so on and so on. So the point is, the real, can we speak of a defeat of democracy in this case? Sorry for the maybe philosophical question. Thank you.
That was very clear. Thank you, Julia. And finally, Christina.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned EU-level taxation to kind of like gain money, to collect money, to repay the debt done during the crisis. I was thinking, given the US Treasury proposal about a minimum global corporate tax, how do you think that European countries can agree, for example, if we consider the Netherlands or Ireland, about establishing a global corporate tax, because they have really different interests, and also, if I'm not wrong, taxation is not a competence of the European Union, but it's a competence of the member states. So how do you think they can agree on these kind of taxes in the, not the long distance future actually, but really pretty soon? Thank you.
Should I?
Please, Bridget.
So firstly, to Francesco on academic institutions and helping students. Unfortunately, the UK did not want an agreement it's withdrawn from Erasmus, and it considers EU 27 citizens as third country international students. And so there's nothing can be done. And I think it also it's important to emphasize that Brexit isn't just about friction in trade. It's about reduced interaction, cultural and social interaction between the UK and the rest of Europe, because only the rich will be able to do it. And so it will reduce, again, if you have to pay third country international fees at British institutions, then that will reduce the number of Europeans, because they're very expensive programs. So it's, in my view, it's a loss, almost a bigger loss than the trade. Also, young British people did not vote for this. And if I were young and British, I would be outraged at the over 55s who took decisions that were going to affect me and not their age group, because they're all on pensions. They've got lots of assets. And again, the idea that that the support for Brexit came predominantly from the north east, which it did, a lot of it, but a lot of very wealthy British in the shires, professional people, voted for Brexit as well. Why? Because it's not going to impact on them at all. They have the money and they have. So I think there's a real intergenerational issue, which is a loss. It's a loss, and the only part of the European education space that the UK wanted to stay in was Horizon Europe research. But research is for academics and researchers, not for students or not for younger people. So it's a disaster. On democracy, so democracy both won and lost. It won in that a larger number of people voted in the UK than they then did vote in general elections. So it got people who were disaffected to go to the ballot, and that's always a good thing. the problem was that the campaign was extremely badly regulated, and it exposed a weakness of campaign financing in the UK. So in Great Britain, there are rules about campaign financing, the amounts and the level of transparency. But it turns out in Northern Ireland, the same rules do not apply. So interestingly, the DUP spent a fortune on political advertising in GB. Why? Because money was funneled to Northern Ireland in order that it not be declared on the books. Cambridge Analytica was a scandal and remains a scandal. But regardless of those, of the fake news and the red bus and the lies about the NHS and all of that, if Cameron and the Remain campaign had had any competence, they could have won that referendum. If you lose a referendum by that small amount, you can win it. And for me, in many ways, the surprise is that the Remain was as high as it was, given the history of British engagement with the EU, given the tabloid press, all of that. So I think for me, the most surprising thing about the Remain campaign was it was all Project Fear, that there was no one in the UK capable of making a compelling argument about the EU and what membership brought. And of course, now, every day, individuals in the UK are learning about the cost of being outside. But they didn't think about this in the lead up to the referendum. So you're on I think once it was a leave vote, then the UK had to leave. I think it would have been smarter for Cameron to have said, this is a two-phase program. If you vote leave, we negotiate, and then we put the final deal to the people again. That would have been smart politics. But as we know, David Cameron, well, what we're discovering, not just about his political competence, but all of the lobbying he's doing on behalf of very wealthy people at the moment. He certainly is vying for the worst British Prime Minister in the last 50 years, but he's in good company. And then on taxation and global tax, and of course low corporation tax areas like the Netherlands and Ireland, the taxation of big tech will be cracked by the Americans. There's been years and years and years of debate in the OECD, and the OECD has done a lot of very good work in basically providing us with data and information on corporate tax and global tax. If Biden puts the weight of the United States and the levers that the US does have behind a global tax system, it will happen. And I have every expectation that it will happen in this cycle. Every expectation. And of course, remember that the Americans will be careful in that they want those big tech companies to continue to be very powerful, and they want them to have global reach, but they also want them rightly to start to pay some tax and not to have such low levels that they're way below the nominal rates where they are. So I think that the debate about corporate tax has been going on a long time. The EU will use the levers it has, but as we know in the Apple case, the competition lever was ruled illegal. So I would rather place my bets on Biden on this one.
Well, thank you to Professor Brigitte Laffan for for our time. We reach really the limit of our time. who's been so generous in providing answers, to all the students for their activism and passion about such topics. Thank you so much. It is the end of this day. We ended in glory, so to say, with this enlightening conversation, and we will be back tomorrow talking about the rule of law and another very topical issue about the futures of integration. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Buonasera Giacomo.
Edo, come va?
Buonasera.
Sei sopravvissuto?
Sì, dai, sono ancora più o meno in piedi. Adesso crollo. Adesso posso crollare. Però, dai, come ti è sembrato? Beh, Brigida è sempre bravissima, insomma, Brigida è sempre, no?
È molto European,
Sì, lo so.
vede sempre il bicchiere mezzo pieno. Anche la pandemia, anche i vaccini, dice, ma insomma dai, ancora in progress, ce la faremo, mannaggia, un disastro. Invece Thomas, prendo anche atto della battuta di Thomas